The bulldozer's engine roared to life at exactly 9 a.m. Black diesel smoke, billowing into the crisp morning air as it rolled toward Diane Fletcher's prized rose garden. She stood frozen on her manicured lawn, still clutching the coffee mug that had slipped from her trembling fingers, watching 20 years of landscaping perfection about to become a construction zone. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been planning this moment for 8 months, ever since she'd declared war on my ranch fence and tried to destroy everything my family had built for 3 generations. But let me take you back to where this all started, because Diane Fletcher's downfall began with a single word: compliance. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I first laid eyes on Diane Fletcher. I was checking the fence line on our family's 40-acre ranch, the same property my grandfather had carved out of raw Texas hill country back in 1952. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture where our quarter horses grazed, and I was enjoying the peace that comes with wide open spaces and honest work. That's when I heard the clicking of expensive heels on gravel behind me. "Excuse me," came a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you the owner of this property?" I turned around to see a woman in her 50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, wearing a white blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She had the kind of smile that never reached her eyes and a clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "My family owns this ranch." "Yes, ma'am." Her smile tightened. "I'm Diane Fletcher, president of the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your fence situation." I looked back at the 6-foot cedar fence that had been standing along our property line for 15 years. It was solid, well-maintained, and built exactly to the specifications my father had used when he expanded the original ranch boundaries. "What about it?" Diane consulted her clipboard with the theatrical precision of someone who lived for these moments. "According to HOA regulations, residential fencing within our community cannot exceed 4 feet in height. Your fence is clearly in violation." The morning suddenly felt colder. "Ma'am, this is a working ranch. We've got quarter horses, cattle, and equipment that needs proper fencing. Plus, this fence was here long before any HOA. "That's irrelevant," Diane snapped. When the Sunset Ridge development was approved in 2019, all properties within the designated boundaries became subject to our covenants and restrictions. "That includes your ranch." She said the word ranch like it tasted bad in her mouth. "You have 30 days to bring your fencing into compliance, or face daily fines of $200. The HOA board has voted, and the decision is final." I felt my temper rising, but I kept my voice level. "Mrs. Fletcher, my family has owned this land for 70 years. We were here long before your subdivision existed. I don't think you have any authority over our property." Diane's laugh was like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Mr. Mitchell, I suggest you review your property deed and the county development records. Geography doesn't lie, and your ranch sits squarely within the Sunset Ridge HOA boundaries." She handed me a manila envelope thick with legal documents. "Everything you need to know is in there. 30 days, Mr. Mitchell. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As she clicked back to her white BMW, I stood there holding those papers and feeling like I'd just been sucker punched. Our ranch, the land my grandfather had literally bled and sweated to build, was suddenly under the control of some suburban HOA? That evening, I spread Diane's documents across the kitchen table, where 3 generations of Mitchells had made family decisions. The paperwork was extensive property maps, HOA bylaws, county zoning records, and legal precedents that made my head spin. But one thing was crystal clear. According to these documents, our ranch property had indeed been included within the Sunset Ridge HOA boundaries when the development was approved. The county had apparently redrawn the community lines to include several existing properties, including ours. I called my lawyer, Tom Rodriguez, a sharp guy who'd handled our family's legal affairs for 20 years. Tom, I need you to look into something. How the hell did our ranch get included in an HOA we never agreed to join? Sarah, that's a great question. Let me dig into the county records and see what happened during the approval process. Sometimes these boundary decisions get made without proper notification to existing landowners. While Tom researched, I had to deal with the immediate crisis. $200 a day in fines would add up fast, and I couldn't afford to fight a prolonged legal battle while hemorrhaging money. But I also couldn't afford to replace 1,500 feet of 6-foot fencing with 4-foot fencing that wouldn't contain our livestock. It was an impossible situation, and Diane Fletcher knew it. What she didn't know was that her impossible situation had just become my full-time obsession. See, here's the thing about ranch families: we don't give up easy. My grandfather had fought drought, economic depression, and corporate developers trying to buy him out. My father had battled environmental regulations and zoning changes that threatened our way of life. And now it was my turn to protect what they'd built. But I had something my ancestors didn't have. I had a master's degree in public administration and 15 years of experience working in local government. Specifically, I was the senior planning coordinator for the county zoning department. The same zoning department that had approved Diane Fletcher's precious HOA boundaries. Over the next few days, I started pulling files. Not just our ranch records, but every document related to the Sunset Ridge development approval. What I found made my blood run cold. The Sunset Ridge project had been fast-tracked through the approval process with minimal public notice and zero input from existing landowners. The boundary modifications that swept up our ranch and several other properties had been submitted as a minor administrative adjustment that didn't require public hearings. But here's where it got interesting. The boundary change request had been submitted by Fletcher Development LLC, Diane Fletcher's husband's company. The same company that had been quietly buying up rural properties around our ranch for the past 5 years, using HOA harassment and legal pressure to force out longtime landowners who couldn't afford to fight. I was starting to see the bigger picture, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. The Fletchers weren't just running an HOA, they were running a land grab operation. Use the HOA to make life impossible for existing property owners, force them to sell cheap, then develop the land for massive profits. Our ranch, with its 40 acres of prime hill country real estate, wasn't just in violation of their fence rules. We were their white whale. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd tried to intimidate someone who understood exactly how the system worked and had the authority to use it against them. The first warning sign came on a Thursday morning when I found Diane Fletcher standing in my front yard, photographing my fence with a professional camera. She had 2 other people with her, a man in an expensive suit and a woman with a measuring tape. "Morning, Diane," I called out from my porch. "Lovely day for trespassing." She looked up with that predatory smile. "Mr. Mitchell, we're conducting an official HOA compliance inspection. According to our bylaws, we have the right to access any property within our jurisdiction for enforcement purposes." I walked down to meet them, noting how the man in the suit stepped protectively closer to Diane. "And you are?" "James Fletcher," he said, not offering his hand. "I'm Mrs. Fletcher's husband and the HOA legal counsel. We're documenting violations for potential litigation." So this was the developer himself. The man behind Fletcher Development LLC and the architect of the land grab scheme I was uncovering. "Well, James, I hate to break it to you, but photographing someone's property without permission is still harassment, HOA or no HOA. And that measuring tape your associate is using? She's about 6 inches onto my land right now." The woman with the tape measure stepped back quickly, but James Fletcher just smiled. "Mr. Mitchell, I think you misunderstand your situation here. Your property is subject to HOA authority whether you like it or not. We can inspect, fine, and ultimately force sale if necessary. Force sale? Diane stepped forward, clearly enjoying this moment. When fines and penalties exceed the property's annual tax assessment, the HOA can place a lion and petition for foreclosure sale. It's all perfectly legal. She paused for effect. Your fence violations alone will generate over $70,000 in fines per year. Add in other compliance issues, we've documented unpermitted structures, livestock odor complaints, noise violations, and you're looking at substantial financial exposure. James nodded smugly. Of course, Fletcher Development would be willing to purchase your property at fair market value to resolve these issues, save you the legal headaches and foreclosure proceedings. And there it was. The whole scheme laid out in plain sight. Create impossible compliance requirements, generate crushing fines, then swoop in with a generous buyout offer at below market prices. That's a very interesting proposal, I said carefully. Let me think about it. As they packed up their equipment, Diane couldn't resist one final shot. Don't think too long, Mr. Mitchell. The fine meter is running, and it doesn't stop for weekends. That afternoon, I sat in my office at the county zoning department and pulled up every file related to Fletcher Development, LLC. What I found was a pattern of behavior that made my stomach turn. Over the past 10 years, the Fletchers had engineered the forced sale of 17 rural properties through HOA harassment and manufactured violations. Each property had been purchased at 40–60% below market value, then either developed or resold for enormous profits. The victims were always the same, longtime rural landowners, often elderly, who couldn't afford extended legal battles against well-funded HOA enforcement actions. But the Fletchers had made their biggest mistake yet when they targeted our ranch. Because unlike their previous victims, I had access to every zoning record, development application, and regulatory filing in the county database. And I was about to use that access to destroy them. The first phase of my counterattack was information gathering. I spent the next 2 weeks building a comprehensive file on every aspect of Fletcher Development's operations. Property acquisitions, zoning variance requests, building permits, environmental impact studies, everything. What I discovered was a web of regulatory violations, procedural shortcuts, and outright fraud that would make any prosecutor's mouth water. Fletcher Development had been submitting false environmental reports to bypass wetland protections. They'd been using shell companies to circumvent foreign ownership restrictions on agricultural land. They'd even been bribing county officials to fast-track approvals and ignore compliance violations. But the smoking gun was their HOA boundary manipulation scheme. I found records showing that the Fletchers had systematically lobbied for HOA boundary expansions that conveniently included properties they wanted to acquire. They'd use their connections in the planning department to classify these expansions as administrative adjustments that didn't require public notice or landowner consent. Then they'd use their new HOA authority to harass property owners with impossible compliance requirements until they sold out. It was brilliant, illegal, and about to blow up in their faces. Because here's what the Fletchers didn't know. I wasn't just a senior planning coordinator. I was the senior planning coordinator who'd been assigned to review all HOA boundary modification requests for the past 3 years, including theirs. The second phase of my plan required careful timing. I needed to let Diane escalate her harassment campaign while I built my case, because the more aggressive she became, the more evidence I'd have of the conspiracy. She didn't disappoint. Over the following month, Diane Fletcher turned our ranch into her personal vendetta. She filed noise complaints every time we started a tractor before 8 a.m. She reported our horses to animal control for allegedly disturbing the peace. She even called the fire department claiming we were burning trash illegally when we were just clearing brush. Each complaint required response time, paperwork, and mounting legal fees to defend against frivolous charges. But the fence remained her primary weapon. Every day at exactly 6 p.m., Diane would drive by our property and photograph the offending fence from different angles. She'd file daily violation reports with the HOA and CC the county on every communication, trying to create an official paper trail of our non-compliance. The fines were adding up exactly as she'd predicted, $200 per day, 7 days a week, with penalty fees and administrative costs tacked on. After 6 weeks, our HOA violation account showed $11,400 in accumulated fines and fees. At this rate, we'd hit the foreclosure threshold in less than a year. But Diane's daily documentation routine was about to become the rope she'd hang herself with. See, every photograph she took, every violation report she filed, every threatening letter her husband's law firm sent us, was creating a detailed record of harassment and attempted extortion. And when she escalated to physical intimidation, I knew it was time to spring my trap. It happened on a Tuesday morning while I was repairing a gate hinge near the fence line. I heard vehicles approaching, looked up to see 3 trucks pulling into the easement along our property boundary. Diane Fletcher stepped out of the first truck, followed by James Fletcher and 4 men I didn't recognize. The strangers looked like construction workers, but they were carrying surveying equipment and what looked like chainsaws. "Mr. Mitchell," James called out, "we're here to conduct emergency abatement of code violations on behalf of the Sunset Ridge HOA. Emergency abatement. That was a legal term that meant they were claiming authority to remove violations immediately without notice or due process. What violations would those be? I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. Diane stepped forward, holding an official-looking document. Your offense constitutes a public safety hazard and violation of community standards. The HOA board has voted to authorize immediate removal to protect property values and community welfare. One of the workers was already firing up his chainsaw. Stop right there, I said loudly. You're about to commit destruction of private property and criminal trespass. I'm calling the sheriff. James Fletcher laughed. Call whoever you want, Mr. Mitchell. We have legal authority for this action, and Sheriff Morrison has already been notified of our enforcement activity. That's when I realized how deep this conspiracy went. Sheriff Morrison was either being paid off or genuinely believed the Fletchers had legal authority to destroy private property based on HOA violations. But they were about to learn that not all county officials were so easily manipulated. Gentlemen, I said, pulling out my phone before you start cutting, I need to make one quick call. I dialed the county's emergency zoning violation hotline, a number that connected directly to the enforcement division of my own department. This is Sarah Mitchell, Senior Planning Coordinator, badge number 4471. I'm reporting an imminent violation of County Zoning Ordinance 15221 regarding unauthorized demolition activities. I gave them our ranch address and hung up. James Fletcher was looking confused, but Diane was still focused on her fence removal mission. Nice try, she said. But HOA authority supersedes county zoning when it comes to covenant enforcement. Actually, Diane, it doesn't. And you're about to find that out the hard way. 10 minutes later, 2 county enforcement vehicles pulled up, followed by a sheriff's deputy who definitely wasn't Sheriff Morrison. The lead enforcement officer, Mike Santos, was someone I'd worked with for years on zoning violations. Sarah, Mike nodded to me, then turned to the Fletcher group. I understand there's some confusion about demolition authority here. James Fletcher stepped forward with his legal documents. Officer, we're conducting authorized HOA enforcement on behalf of the Sunset Ridge community. All our permits are in order. Mike examined the papers for about 30 seconds, then handed them back. "Sir, these documents don't constitute demolition permits. They're HOA violation notices, which have no legal standing for property destruction." "But the fence is in violation of community standards," Diane protested. "Ma'am, community standards don't override county building codes or private property rights. If you want to remove someone's fence, you need court authorization and proper permits." Mike turned to the construction workers. "Gentlemen, if you cut so much as one board of that fence without proper permits, you'll be charged with destruction of property and unlawful demolition. Your contractor's licenses will be suspended pending investigation." The workers started packing up their equipment immediately. Nobody wanted to lose their livelihood over Diane Fletcher's fence obsession. But James Fletcher wasn't giving up. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The HOA has clear authority to enforce community standards within our boundaries." "Mr. Fletcher," Mike said with the patience of someone who dealt with entitled developers before, "HOA authority is limited to things like paint colors and landscaping. You can't tear down structures without court orders and county permits." He paused. "And before you ask, no, Sheriff Morrison doesn't have authority to override county zoning enforcement. Two different jurisdictions, sir." As the Fletcher crew retreated, Diane shot me a look that could have melted steel. "This isn't over, Mitchell. We'll get a court order and be back next week." "Looking forward to it," I replied, because what she didn't know was that her attempt to illegally destroy my property had just given me everything I needed to destroy her. That afternoon, I compiled a comprehensive report documenting the Fletcher conspiracy. 15 years of fraudulent property acquisitions, illegal HOA boundary manipulations, bribery of county officials, and now attempted destruction of private property. But I didn't file it with local prosecutors who might be compromised. I sent it directly to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and the State Attorney General's Fraud Unit. Because the Fletchers hadn't just been running a local scam, they'd been using federal banking systems to launder their proceeds and crossing state lines to hide assets. That made it a federal case. The next phase of their downfall was about to begin, and they had no idea what was coming. While the Fletchers regrouped from their failed fence destruction, I used my position in the zoning department to conduct what I called a comprehensive compliance review of all Fletcher development properties. What I found was staggering. Fletcher Development had 17 active projects with a combined value of over $50 million. Every single one had zoning violations, permit irregularities, or environmental compliance issues that should have stopped construction immediately. Their flagship project, the Sunset Ridge development itself, was built on land that had wetland protection restrictions they'd bypassed through fraudulent environmental reports. 3 of their residential developments were using septic systems that violated groundwater protection ordinances. Their latest commercial project was 6 months behind on required traffic impact studies and stormwater management plans. But the most damaging discovery was their resort development project on Lake Travis, which was supposed to include affordable housing units as required by their zoning variants. Instead, they'd built luxury condos and used shell company accounting to hide the compliance violation. Each violation carried potential fines ranging from over $10,000 to $100,000 per day until resolved. Fletcher Development was looking at potential penalties exceeding $2 million if all violations were enforced simultaneously. And as the senior planning coordinator, I had the authority to initiate enforcement action on every single one. But I wanted to give Diane one more chance to escalate before I pulled the trigger. Because the more aggressive she became, the more justification I'd have for throwing the book at her entire operation. She exceeded my wildest expectations. 3 days after the failed fence-cutting incident, I came home from work to find surveyor stakes scattered across our pasture. Someone had been on our property conducting unauthorized surveying activities, probably trying to find property line disputes they could exploit. Then I found the dead rabbits. Someone had left 4 dead rabbits near our livestock water tanks, along with a note warning about disease risks from unmanaged rural properties that threatened community health and safety. The message was clear: comply with our demands or face escalating consequences. But Diane's biggest mistake came that weekend when she organized what she called a community awareness campaign about the agricultural threats to Sunset Ridge property values. She scheduled a town hall meeting at the community center and sent flyers to every household within 5 miles. The flyer included aerial photos of our ranch, with our address clearly marked and language suggesting we were a nuisance operation that was destroying neighborhood character. She was essentially organizing a harassment campaign against our family. That's when I decided it was time to end this. Monday morning, I walked into work and submitted enforcement actions against every single Fletcher development property in the county. 17 simultaneous violations, totaling $2.3 million in immediate fines, with daily accumulating penalties until each issue was resolved. I also submitted a comprehensive report to the county attorney documenting the pattern of harassment, intimidation, and attempted destruction of private property the Fletchers had engaged in over the past 3 months. But the piece de resistance was my report to the state licensing board regarding James Fletcher's law practice. Using HOA authority to threaten foreclosure sales, organizing harassment campaigns against private citizens, and attempting to destroy property without legal authorization were all violations of legal ethics that could result in disbarment. By noon, Fletcher Development had received 17 separate stop work orders, halting all their active projects. Their office phone was ringing non-stop with contractors, investors, and lenders demanding explanations. James Fletcher called me directly at 2 p.m. "Sarah, what the hell do you think you're doing? These violation notices are harassment pure and simple. James, they're enforcement actions based on documented code violations at your properties. I'm just doing my job. Your job? You think it's your job to target private citizens over personal disputes?" I almost laughed. Personal disputes? James, you tried to destroy my property with chainsaws last week. You've been harassing my family for months with frivolous complaints and illegal fines. Your wife has been trespassing on our land and organizing harassment campaigns against us. That's different. We were enforcing legitimate HOA authority. No, you were running an extortion scheme, and now you're facing the consequences. There was a long silence on the line. When James spoke again, his voice had lost its arrogant edge. "What do you want, Sarah? What's it going to take to resolve this? I want you to drop all HOA actions against our ranch permanently. I want a written apology from Diane, acknowledging that she exceeded her authority and harassed our family. And I want Fletcher Development to pay for an independent legal review of every property acquisition you've made through HOA pressure over the past 10 years. That's impossible. Do you have any idea what that would cost? Less than $2.3 million in daily accumulating violation fines. But James, that's just the beginning. The next morning, federal agents raided the Fletcher Development offices and Diane's home. The FBI had taken my report seriously and launched a full investigation into their land acquisition scheme. What they found exceeded even my expectations. Financial records showing systematic mortgage fraud, tax evasion through shell company structures, and evidence of bribing county officials dating back 15 years. The state attorney general simultaneously announced fraud charges against both Fletcher's and 3 county employees who'd been taking bribes to expedite their projects. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Agent Martinez, the FBI investigator leading the case. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you personally. Your documentation of the Fletcher scheme helped us uncover one of the largest HOA fraud conspiracies we've seen in Texas. We estimate they've illegally acquired over $30 million worth of property through systematic harassment and extortion. What happens to the families who lost their homes? That's the best part. We're working with the state to establish a victim restitution fund using seized Fletcher assets. Every family that was forced to sell through their scheme will have the opportunity to buy back their property at the original sale price, plus damages for their suffering." Within 6 months, the Fletcher empire had completely collapsed. Diane Fletcher was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and racketeering. James Fletcher got 12 years for orchestrating the scheme and bribing public officials. Sheriff Morrison was forced to resign after the investigation revealed he'd been taking payments to ignore complaints against Fletcher development projects. All 17 Fletcher development properties were seized and sold to pay victim restitution and federal fines. The Sunset Ridge HOA was dissolved and replaced with a legitimate homeowners association that actually served community interests instead of developer profits. But the most poetic justice came when our ranch was officially recognized as a historic family farm and granted protection status that made it permanently exempt from any future HOA jurisdiction. The fence that started this whole war? It's still standing, exactly 6 feet tall, protecting our horses and serving as a reminder that sometimes the right fight is worth whatever it costs. 6 months after Diane's sentencing, I was repairing that same gate hinge when I heard a familiar sound, expensive heels clicking on gravel. My heart rate spiked for a moment before I turned around and saw a woman in her 30s, professionally dressed, but with a warm smile. "Mrs. Mitchell? I'm Rebecca Thornton from the Texas Historical Commission. I wanted to personally thank you for your work exposing the Fletcher scheme." She handed me a certificate. "Your ranch has been designated as a Texas Historic Family Farm, with full protection from future development pressure and zoning changes." "That's wonderful," I said, examining the certificate. "But why are you here personally?" Rebecca's smile widened. "Because my grandparents lost their ranch to a Fletcher development acquisitions 8 years ago. Thanks to your evidence, we're getting it back next month." As she drove away, I looked out across the 40 acres my grandfather had carved from raw hill country, the pastures my father had improved and expanded, and the fence line I'd fought to protect. Sometimes the system works exactly like it's supposed to. Sometimes the right person with the right knowledge ends up in the right position to stop the wrong people from destroying what matters most. And sometimes, just sometimes, David really does beat Goliath. The fence is still standing, the horses are still grazing, and the Mitchell Ranch will be here for another 3 generations to protect. As for what happened to all those federal charges and seized assets, well, that's another story entirely. One involving offshore accounts, political corruption, and a paper trail that led all the way to the state capitol. But I'll save that story for another time.